I would like to personally welcome you to this very special series of lessons on the secret of prosperity. Really, if you study prosperity, there are a few secrets. But to some who have not studied it, it's all secretive. So we would like to bring you into a place of knowledge regarding prosperity and how you can have fullness in this life and also fullness in the life to come. In this special series of lessons, this is number 3. The title of it is Nations and Prosperity. I trust that you will permit me to begin with nations, because nations can be prosperous as well as families or as well as persons. We will deal with these individually. In the book of Nehemiah, in chapter 2 and verse 20, this man Nehemiah was one of Israel's last great statesmen. He was a man that was very high in position in the Persian court when Persia was the master of the world in the Persian Empire. And from that high place, he had a burden for his country. And here's what we read. In Nehemiah 2 and 20, it says, "Then answered I them," those are the enemies of Israel he was talking to, "and I said unto them, Now the God of heaven will prosper us." Here was a dynamic political leader and spiritual leader who said, "The God of heaven will prosper us." That word prosper, is an exciting word. I gave you the definitions of prosperity in a former lesson. But he said, this God of heaven, it's good to know your source of prosperity. In our country, if there was no more rain, there would be no prosperity. The whole nation would starve to death. And so we have a relationship with heaven, with the God of heaven. And rain will come in proper season. The sun will come in proper seasons. And that the pest will not be permitted to eat up. And I do believe that we as a nation could rebuke pest that is destroying a lot of our grain and our fruit in our land today and come against it, that we would find it even different, even now. So, but this God of heaven will prosper us. Therefore, we, his servants, the nation of Israel, as the servants of the living God, we, his servants, will arise and build. Now that's positive, you see. That was a assurance that they could be blessed as a nation. And we can be blessed. We are blessed as a nation, and we do thank God for that. I think that in these lessons and also in your own life, we must come to the valid truth that we are all citizens of planet Earth. All human beings are citizens of planet Earth. That we are what we call the Earth family, totally, all of us. And that we are together as nations. That we are together as races. That we are together even as tribes. That a poor, poverty-ridden country means unlimited human suffering. There does not have to be a single poverty-ridden nation on the face of this earth. Almost every nation in the world has some kind of wealth. If it was developed with integrity, they would have plenty for everybody. When you study national prosperity or national poverty, there are several elements you have to consider. In the case of this great statesman of Israel named Nehemiah, he made a positive statement in that he had a personal relationship with the God of heaven. Now that is really the beginning of prosperity. It does not begin with making a dollar or turning a good deal. That is not the beginning. The beginning of it is a relationship with God. Otherwise, you can be up and down like a yo-yo, and that's not a very happy situation either. I think we must tell people that our God is a God of prosperity, that God raises up nations and gives them national wealth. I don't know that God is too pleased with us at the present time, wasting much of the wealth that he's given this nation. We are wasters of it in many directions, and we haven't used the wealth in the way that God would be pleased that we use that wealth. But from the Garden of Eden, which was the beginning of the story of mankind, God has had a desire that all men be prosperous. God's prosperous. He's not poor at all. And God desires that all men be prosperous. Now, One of the remarkable and magnificent pictures of this is with Daniel. Now, Daniel was a prince in Israel, and he was taken captive into Babylon. And Babylon was the first truly world empire, for one nation and one king ruled planet Earth, that there were no standing armies against him, that he was the ruler of anyone that stood up to say they were free. He was the only one that could speak that freedom to them. And that was a world empire. Now Daniel saw very plainly in the first world empire of Babylon, of which he was a part of, in spiritual dreams and visions, both himself and the emperor, and they witnessed the place of God in world prosperity. Now you should study the book of Daniel and see that, because if we're not going to accept that, we're always going to have secrets and mysteries about prosperity, not understanding. When I was in England right after the war, they had been the first nation on the face of the earth. Before the war, they were the richest nation on the face of the earth. When the war was over, I had Englishmen to talk to me and said, "What happened? This food we have comes from America. You mean we can't feed ourselves anymore?" Their prosperity had gone, and they didn't know where it had gone. They couldn't understand how it had left. Now, people that don't study, of course, will not know. But God wants you and me to understand something. Prosperity moves across the stage of time, beginning with Adam and Eve and coming down to until today. Now, I want to give you something that I hope you will never forget. You could call it the cycle of prosperity if you wanted to. The historical story of national emergence, that is the beginning of a nation, whether it be Israel or whether it be America or England, where it rises from emergence into affluence and becomes a different people through its affluence, and later enters into a state of deterioration, to where it is a deteriorated economy and a deteriorated people. It is a story of the history of the human race. Babylon is gone. The Egyptian empire is gone. The Persian empire is gone. Khomeini is over there and a few others, but the luster of the Persian empire is gone. History confirms to us that nations and empires of past civilizations have passed through certain stages, or steps, if you like to call it that, into a cycle that begins in bondage, where they're slaves, and it goes up into affluence and the freedoms and comes back into bondage again. That the grandchildren do not want the freedom that their parents had. It is an amazing thing. Now follow my steps through it, and I'll do them as quick as I can. The first is hope. In my travels in 100 nations of the world, and in my study of history, I find that all people that are subjected to bondage, I have a hope. I hope I'll be free someday. I hope the slavery will be gone. I hope that one day, and they hope, and they hope, and they hope. Like the Israelis hoping for the Messiah. They leave an empty seat at the end of the table for the Messiah. And they say, if not today, tomorrow. They hope one day that hope will be fulfilled and completed. And what a rejoicing that day will be. And so the seed of prosperity begins and originates in hope. That when you have hope, hope will do something. On the road to freedom, hope is your beginning point. And then hope increases like a ray of light, and it gives birth to faith. You begin saying, hey, I can do it. I can get free. The children of Israel were in bondage in Egypt. Hope rose. I wish I was free. And then faith came, and they were free, you see. And so America's the same. The people that started this country and the people that are arriving here today, it came out of dungeons, came out of prison houses, came out of distress, and they had hope. And one day that hope rose up a step higher. It went into faith. I believe, I believe, I believe. And they moved up to the faith. The captive begins believing his captivity will terminate and it will end and that freedom will come. He has faith to be free. And you take a person who has faith that they will be free, something happens inside of them. True faith does not know fear. You got it? Faith does not cringe in a dark corner. Faith is an act. So it begins to shake chains that bind, chains on the arms and chains on the doors. And a man with courage is convinced he can be free because faith gives birth to courage. Men of faith have courage. Men of faith don't run from anybody. Men of faith stand, and men of faith fight. And so from this faith, courage is born, and a man is willing to die for his convictions. That's what faith will do for you. And so you have convictions, and that brings courage. And when you have courage, yeah, you may be small. The American armies that wanted to release us from Britain were much smaller, but they were more determined, you see. Over in the Near East today, you've got about 4 million Jews and 100 million Arabs, but the difference there is courage, you see. That it's born of faith and courage, and that courage, you see, creates freedom. It creates freedom. Hope and faith and courage make the captive to conquer. When you've got hope and faith and courage, you're a conqueror, you see. And so the slave shakes off his bondage and he becomes free. But then freedom gives birth to abundance. Now follow me closely. Maybe you want to write them down as I go. Freedom gives birth to abundance. Free men are always outproducers and overproducers. Nobody can stay up with a free man. That's the reason Russia can't overcome us and can't do anything against us, for the simple reason we're free men and we are producers. They'd starve to death if we didn't feed them our grain every year. They'd starve, that's all. And the only place that has grain is the free world. It's Canada, United States, and Australia, and a little bit from Argentina. And there's the breadbaskets of the world. And those are free lands where people are free, you see. Czechoslovakia don't feed anybody. Russia don't feed anybody. Poland don't feed anybody. They all need help because they're not free. Freedom and production go together. Slaves may be driven to produce quotas, but only free men can reach out toward goals that bestow upon them abundance and plenty. So abundance and plenty, prosperity is born of freedom. The story of mankind is from slavery or poverty to freedom, and in freedom they have their prosperity. All the empires of the world became prosperous in their freedom times. But as this cycle continues, abundance, listen carefully, in its natural state leads to selfishness. It may be that America has come to that. So now we have moved through courage and freedom and abundance, and through abundance we got selfish. People that don't have much normally are not selfish at all. They just give you what they got. But wealth creates selfishness if you don't make it do what it should do. You got to determine within yourself that you won't be selfish, or you will lose what you have. And so in this cycle, we come to a state called selfishness. It seems that the more a man gets, then the more his natural man wants. You see, the more his natural man wants. And so he enters into a state of selfishness. But remember, man is always shifting. Man is always moving. Man is never static. In the 80s is not the 70s. The 70s is not the 60s. And the 60s are not the 50s, you see. And the 90s will not be the 80s. Those that are rich in the 80s may be poverty-ridden in the 90s because they haven't followed the formula that God wants them to. All right. So when you have plenty and you become selfish, in selfishness, man eventually becomes complacent. If not you, your children will be. He decides that he's always had the ability to produce plenty and that he can do it anytime, and he becomes complacent. However, this complacency is a destroyer, because complacency produces apathy. Apathy. That unconcerned spirit that drifts along, accepting whatever comes, ignoring dangers, ignoring conditions as they really are, and they enter into an apathetic world. There are a lot of businessmen in this country today. The reason their business is in trouble, they're apathetic. They were in a state of complacency after the abundance that God had given them, and now they're in a state of apathy. Now apathy can only do one thing, and our great industries in this country are seeing it right now. Finally, history shows us that apathy does not produce for itself. Apathy does not produce for itself. Soon man becomes dependent upon the provision and supply of others. Why do we have so much foreign things in our land? Because you can't produce them. And if you do, you're so lazy, they do it twice as quick as you do, and you demand more and waste it. A lot of the prosperity that God gives to you, if it goes into alcohol, if it goes into nicotine, if it goes into whoredom, with playing with harlots, if it goes into amusements, well, you're still nothing, you know, you're just still nothing. You're not a builder. You're in this apathetic stage of civilization on its way back somewhere. We're going to find out right now. History shows that when man becomes apathy, or when a state does or a country does, and does not produce for itself, that soon becomes an area or a people dependent upon the provision and supply of others. And we may be moving that direction right now. Thus the free man and the provider, who was one time the supplier, now becomes the debtor. Are you here? Dependency ultimately brings the material equivalent of bondage and slavery. Dependency. When you depend on the government, neighbor, you're a slave of the government. You go in and talk sharp to that little old gal sitting behind the desk, and she'll write your name off, and you don't get anything else. You're finished. You better listen to me. Dependency ultimately brings material equivalent of bondage and slavery. Anytime you can't provide for yourself, you're a slave to somebody. That's a sad story of 6,000 years of human history. This human government, the human movement of prosperity is very exciting. I am more excited about this than I have been for something in a long time. And I'd like to teach you the movement, of prosperity. Across the world that we live in today, the movement of it. And in the Gospel of Matthew chapter 16 and verse 26, it says, "What is a man profited if he should gain the whole world and lose his own soul?" Isn't that amazing? Material prosperity without spiritual prosperity is nothing. And lose his own soul. Or what shall a man give in exchange for his soul? There isn't anything on this earth that you can exchange for your soul. Your soul is the most important thing that you have. You have to know that. You have to realize it. The story of nations is just exactly what I've told you in the last few minutes. The story of nations is actually the story of prosperity. When you are an empire, you're rich, you see. And when you're without an empire, you're not rich, you see. That's the way it goes. Man searches for mountains of gold. He searches the seas for gold, for treasure. He searches in the awful cold of northern Alaska for gold. He endures the heat of the tropics for gold. Man is forever seeking wealth. He is forever seeking prosperity. Even though he might seek it in the sands of Egypt, he is seeking prosperity. And the treasures of yesterday are not where they were yesterday. The treasures of prosperity move because men's dispositions change. You see, the story of prosperity are the 9 cycles that I just showed you, are the nine steps or platforms that we reach through. And the reason that a nation is rich in one generation and poor in another. When I was a boy, England possessed the vast treasures of Egypt. Go to London, you can see them today. India, they also owned. China, they could get anything they wanted from there. France received great treasures from Syria, Africa, Indochina, and other parts of her empire. And if they don't treat those right, you see, prosperity can leave you. It can go. So I have personally witnessed my own self the movement of treasure from China to Japan. I left North China from Tianjin and Peking on trains that were loaded, several boxcars full of the silver and the gold of China. They raped the banks. The Japanese soldiers rode on top of those cars, on the sides of those cars, with their guns to protect them, because inside of them they emptied all the banks of silver and gold and precious stones, put it on boxcars, and it started off for Tokyo. And their prosperity had gone to another land. And the reason for it are those 9 steps that I showed you there, you see. And Japan, with its vitality and with its desire, reached out to take the treasures all around them. And they took them. However, they lost them in an ill-fated war, you see. They lost their prosperity in an ill-fated war. They were not able to continue their prosperity. But because of war, their riches went down the drain. If we could teach you that all nations can have prosperity, and if all nations will follow these cycles that we're telling you about, you don't have to go through that cycle, by the way. America does not have to go back into bondage. But America is in a form of bondage right now. Every one of you that are indebted to the bank, you're a slave to the bank. And you better believe me. There are many people watching me right now that you owe more than you can make in the next 10 years. And that's where you're so gloomy. That's not prosperity. Yeah, you might dress in a nice suit, but have you paid for it? You know, you might drive a pretty automobile. Is it paid for? It's better to drive a lesser one and then have it paid for. Now, prosperity is not having stuff around you that you don't own. Prosperity is, number one, a right relationship with God. Yeah. Oh, you say, I know rich people. Oh, you just know rich people. You don't know prosperous people. Yeah. There are people that have wealth around them that are so unhappy they commit suicide. If you call that prosperity, I got another name for it. There are people around you that their riches, they live in hell. They scream at each other. They fight each other. The family's all messed up. Divorced 4 or 5 times. If you think that's prosperity, you can have it. I don't want it. Prosperity to me is a full life. You're not only prosperous at your office, you're prosperous in your house. You're not only prosperous with a businessman, you're prosperous with your children. So it's a full-orbed thing, and we must bring you into it. Now, nations can enjoy prosperity. We read where this man Nehemiah, he pulled the whole nation up with him. He had personal prosperity. He wasn't seeking anything for himself. He had everything that a human could want. He was a top man in the Persian court where there was total prosperity. You see, so he had it. So it wasn't a personal thing of get rich. I'll make a deal and I'll get so much. No, his desire was only for a nation. There are men that are so big and so great that they don't build themselves. They build a community, they build a city, or they build a nation. There are men that can build nations. Yeah. There are men that can build families. One man builds a whole family. Strength, you see. But if it isn't on a proper foundation, it won't last. We'll get into that in some lessons to come. If it's not properly done and properly lived by, it won't last. It cannot last. It can only last when it's done right. Now, America follows the prosperity signal real good. But we should look at Babylon and see that it is no more. We should look at Persia and see that it is no more. And Egypt that has to live off of other people because they're starving to death there. And we should look at all these things. They were once rich nations. But something didn't go right. Number one, relationship with God didn't go right. Number two, that thing called affluence came. And their top people died inside on luxuries. Drunk themselves to death and lived with harlots. And the nation died. A nation is like a human. The human body can only be healthy when the proper things are functioning in it. A nation is the same. You can be in a dying nation, maybe not even realize it. I had a man in England, a very learned man, before the war. He said, "Sir, I want to tell you something. The British Empire is dead." I said, "Where?" I'd been all over it. I'd been to Australia, New Zealand, in Hong Kong, in India, and now I was in Britain. Where? He says, "I'm sorry, you can't see it. The empire's dead." He says, "You'll see it in your lifetime." Well, that was a man with a vision. He saw the ingredients of death, you see. Well, I believe that you can study America and see the total ingredients of death. That we're on a downward swing. We've already reached the top. On a downward swing to poverty. To poverty. Yeah. For the simple reason, we haven't lived right. We haven't had the right attitude. Rather than selling our grain to the communists that don't believe in God, why don't we give it to the poor people on the face of the earth? Or better than that, go over and plant it for them. Put in some irrigation systems. Teach those people something. Why don't we take control of the world, not in armies, in God's love? Caring one for another, blessing one another, helping one another. There's a way to do it. And we're going to get, in our next lesson, to families and its relationship to prosperity. It's really, really very exciting. If there's anything more exciting, it's the person and prosperity. Just a person and prosperity. But the nation and prosperity is also exciting because ultimately you'll be what your nation is. If America goes clear down, we're all down with it. We're all down with it. And so we shouldn't be selfish and look at ourselves, nor at our family. We should look at our country. I want America to be great. I want America to be prosperous. I don't want to be prosperous by myself. I don't want to be prosperous just in my family. I want to be prosperous as part of a nation being blessed of God. And that's the reason and the purpose of bringing you all these exciting lessons on the secrets of prosperity. I'll be bringing you thoughts that you never dreamed about before, and it's time that we look at them.